Before he became the emperor who somehow picked a fight with the ocean, Caligula was just a Roman boy with a very long name. His full name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. A name so long, it sounds like his parents tried to fit the entire family tree onto a birth certificate. But history remembers him by a much smaller, much cuter nickname, Caligula. It means little boots. Yes, one of Rome's most infamous emperors was basically named Baby Boots. When he was young, Caligula followed his father, Germanicus, during military campaigns. The soldiers loved him because he wore a tiny soldier's uniform and tiny military boots. To them, he was not a future tyrant, he was the adorable mascot of the army. Unfortunately, history has a strange habit of turning cute children into terrifying adults. Caligula's father, Germanicus, was one of the most popular men in Rome. He was handsome, successful, loved by the army, and respected by the people. In other words, he was exactly the kind of person Roman politics usually destroys. And sure enough, Germanicus died when Caligula was still young. After that, Caligula's family was pulled into the brutal world of Roman power struggles. In Rome, being close to the throne was not a privilege, it was a warning sign. If people loved you too much, you became dangerous. If the army respected you too much, you became dangerous. And if you had a claim to the imperial family, congratulations, you were now very dangerous. Caligula grew up surrounded by suspicion, betrayal, and fear. The palace was not a home, it was a beautiful trap with marble floors. Every smile could hide a knife. Every dinner could be your last dinner. And every relative was either family or competition. So no, Caligula did not exactly have a normal childhood. While other children learned games, Caligula learned survival. While other children worried about homework, Caligula worried about which powerful adult might destroy his family next. This does not excuse what he would later become. But it does help explain why the boy called Little Boots grew into a man who trusted almost no one. And when a suspicious man becomes emperor of Rome, things can get very weird, very fast. Because this little boy would one day command armies, terrify senators, and eventually march his soldiers straight toward the sea. But before he went to war with the ocean, Rome first had to make him emperor. In the year 37 AD, Emperor Tiberius finally died. Rome, after years of fear and suspicion, suddenly looked up and asked one very dangerous question. Who comes next? And the answer was a young man with a famous father, a tragic childhood, and the nickname Little Boots. Caligula became emperor when he was only about 24 years old. For Rome, this felt like a fresh start. The old emperor was gone. The son of beloved Germanicus was now in charge. And everyone thought, surely this will go well. History, however, was already preparing popcorn. At first, Caligula was extremely popular. The people loved him because he was young, generous, and connected to a heroic family name. The army liked him because he was Germanicus's son. The Senate liked him because they thought he might be easy to control. And Caligula liked Caligula because of course he did. He began his reign by doing things that made people happy. He gave bonuses to soldiers. He organized public games. He gave gifts, staged spectacles, and reminded everyone that Rome was supposed to be fun again. For a brief moment, Rome looked at Caligula and saw hope. Unfortunately, hope is expensive. Festivals cost money. Gifts cost money. Keeping an entire empire entertained also cost money. And the Roman treasury was not a magic bag. Sooner or later, someone had to explain the budget. And that someone was probably having the worst day of his life. Your Majesty, he said, we have a small problem. The problem, of course, was not small. Rome was running out of money. Caligula looked at the empty treasury. Then he looked at the wealthy nobles. The wealthy nobles looked back and immediately regretted being wealthy nobles. And just like that, the honeymoon period was over. Rome had wanted a young, exciting emperor. What it got was Caligula. At first, Caligula looked like the emperor Rome had been waiting for. Young, energetic, generous, and very good at making people clap. But there was one tiny problem. Caligula was not very good at being told no. And in politics, that is usually where the trouble starts. The Senate expected respect. Caligula expected applause. The Senate wanted tradition. Caligula wanted everyone to remember who had the crown. This was not a recipe for peace. Soon, Caligula began treating the Senate less like partners and more like furniture that occasionally complained. Senators smiled in public, then whispered in corners, then smiled again when Caligula turned around. Roman politics was basically a dinner party where everyone brought a knife, and Caligula decided to bring a bigger knife. He started embarrassing powerful people in public, he made nobles nervous, he made senators angry, and most importantly, he made everyone unsure what he would do next. That kind of uncertainty is terrifying when the person causing it owns the army. Over time, the young emperor became less of a fresh start and more of a walking political weather disaster. Rome had survived bad emperors before, but Caligula was different. He did not just want obedience, he wanted performance. He wanted people to act like his power was not just legal, but divine. And that made people very, very uncomfortable. Especially the senators, who preferred their emperors powerful, but not impossible to predict. Unfortunately for them, Caligula was becoming impossible to predict. One day he was generous, the next day terrifying, and sometimes he was both before lunch. So Rome smiled, clapped, bowed, and quietly started to worry. Because when a ruler becomes unpredictable, everyone starts making plans. And in Rome, those plans rarely ended with a polite conversation. Now, being emperor of Rome was not just about wearing a fancy purple cloak, although, to be fair, the cloak was very fancy. A Roman emperor had to prove he deserved power. He needed respect from the people, loyalty from the army, and at least the illusion that the Senate still mattered. That last one was optional, depending on the emperor. But there was one thing every emperor wanted: glory. And in Rome, glory usually came with an army. Julius Caesar had Gaul, Augustus had peace after civil war, Germanicus had the love of the soldiers, Caligula had little boots. That was not enough. If Caligula wanted to look like a great emperor, he needed a great campaign. Not a small campaign, not a boring campaign. He needed something dramatic, something distant, something that sounded impressive at parties. And conveniently, there was one place across the water that Rome had not fully conquered yet. Britannia. To the Romans, Britannia was strange, cold, and annoyingly surrounded by ocean. It was the kind of place Roman soldiers heard about and immediately checked if they had vacation days. Julius Caesar had crossed into Britannia before, but Rome had never truly swallowed the island. For Caligula, that made it perfect. A mysterious island, a dangerous sea crossing, a chance to say, "Look at me, I am definitely a real conqueror." So Caligula gathered his army. He marched north, toward the edge of Gaul, toward the sea. And somewhere across that sea, Britannia waited in the fog. Unfortunately, there was one tiny issue with conquering an island. You have to cross the water first. So now, imagine you are a Roman soldier. You have marched for days. Your feet hurt. Your armor is heavy. Your food tastes like someone invented sadness and put it in bread. And your emperor has promised glory, which sounds nice, until you realize the glory is on the other side of the ocean. And suddenly glory looks very wet. The army reached the northern coast of Gaul. Ahead of them was the sea. Beyond that sea was Britannia, and between the two was a very important problem called water. Roman soldiers were brave. They could fight barbarians, they could march through forests, they could survive terrible food. But crossing the sea was different. This was not just walking with extra steps. This was ships, waves, wind, supplies, timing, and everyone trying not to vomit. To invade Britannia, Caligula needed ships, he needed logistics, he needed discipline. Most importantly, he needed the soldiers to actually get on the ships. And that is where things may have become complicated. Some soldiers may have been nervous. Some may have doubted the plan. Some may have looked at Caligula and thought, are we completely sure about this guy? Because remember, this was not Julius Caesar. This was Caligula. A man who could turn a meeting into a crisis before breakfast. So when he told the army to prepare for Britannia, the army prepared, slowly, nervously, and possibly with the enthusiasm of men being asked to fight a wet, moving floor. And then Caligula looked at the sea looked back. And history quietly reached for the popcorn again. And then came the moment history would never forget. Caligula stood on the shore and made a decision. A strange decision, a very Caligula decision. He did not order a retreat. He did not order a careful crossing. He did not order patience. He ordered the army to prepare for battle. Against whom? Good question. The answer was the sea. Yes, the sea. Vast, wet, and quietly minding its own business. But for whatever reason, Caligula decided the ocean needed to be taught a lesson. Roman soldiers looked at the sea continued being sea. Waves rolled in, no insults, no threats, just water. Caligula gave the command. The troops formed up along the beach, standards were raised, shields were lifted, spears were ready. Somewhere, a Roman soldier probably wanted to ask a question, but this did not feel like a good moment for questions. So the army did what Roman armies do best, it obeyed. Men advanced toward the surf. Some may even have struck at the waves. Which is not a sentence most generals expect to hear. The sea, to its credit, put up almost no resistance. And somehow, this may have counted as a victory. Because soon, Caligula acted like the battle had been won. The soldiers were then given one of the strangest military orders in Roman history. They were told to collect seashells. Yes, seashells. Spoils of the ocean, fit for Rome and the capital. And just like that, the war against the sea became even stranger. So there they were, soldiers of Rome, conquerors of nations, builders of roads, masters of discipline, and now apparently, professional seashell collectors. The soldiers bent down and gathered shells from the sand. Not gold, not weapons, not enemy banners, shells. Tiny, crunchy trophies of the sea. Caligula called them spoils of war, which is impressive because the enemy was water. Imagine trying to explain that in a military report. Enemy defeated. Casualties? None. Enemy response? Splash. Spoils collected? Confusing. But Caligula was satisfied. In his mind, Rome had won. The ocean had been challenged, the ocean had been attacked, and the ocean had surrendered its shells. Truly, one of the military achievements of all time. The soldiers, meanwhile, probably had questions. Questions like, are we done? Do we salute the shells? Is the sea going to counterattack? But no one said these things out loud, because this was still the emperor. And when the emperor says shells are trophies, shells are trophies. So the Roman army collected them, carefully, seriously, like men who knew history was watching and history was judging. Then the shells were packed up for Rome, because nothing says imperial glory like a box full of beach trash. After the shells were collected, there was still one important question. What now? Because normally, after a great Roman victory, there were celebrations. Trumpets, crowds, captured enemies, treasure carts, and generals trying very hard to look humble while everyone screamed their name. Caligula wanted that feeling. Unfortunately, the victory was made of seashells. This created a small public relations problem. How do you make "we fought the beach" sound impressive? The official version probably needed some help, so the shells became trophies, the beach became a battlefield, and the ocean became an enemy that had somehow been defeated by paperwork. Back in Rome, people heard stories. Some stories sounded heroic, some sounded confusing, and some sounded exactly like what happened, which was the problem. The Senate probably did not know whether to laugh, worry, or pretend this was normal. Pretending was usually the safest option. Because when an emperor says the ocean lost, arguing can be bad for your health. So they nodded, they clapped, they praised the victory very carefully. Meanwhile, the soldiers had to carry the shells home, across roads, through towns, past people who had no idea they were looking at the spoils of a war against water. Imagine being a soldier on that march. You left to conquer Britannia, you returned with beach decorations. And somehow you were supposed to feel proud. This is how empires become confusing. Not all at once, but one seashell at a time. At first, the seashell victory may have sounded funny, because it was funny. An emperor had marched an army to the sea, declared victory over water, and brought home beach souvenirs. That is the kind of story people remember, but in Rome, jokes had a habit of becoming dangerous. Especially when the joke was about the emperor. Laugh too loudly and someone might ask what was so funny. And nobody wanted to explain. The emperor lost a war to common sense. So people smiled carefully, senators praised carefully, soldiers remembered carefully. Because everyone understood the same thing. Caligula was not just strange anymore. He was unpredictable. And unpredictable rulers make everyone nervous. The Senate became nervous. The nobles became nervous. The guards became nervous. And when the guards get nervous, history starts paying attention. The Praetorian Guard was not just decoration. They protected the emperor. They watched the emperor. And if things got bad enough, they could also become a very serious problem for the emperor. Caligula, however, did not seem interested in making fewer enemies. He humiliated people. He frightened people. He made powerful men feel small. And powerful men do not usually enjoy feeling small. Slowly, private conversations began to change. At first, people complained, then they worried, then they started asking a much darker question. What happens if the emperor is the problem? That question was dangerous. But by now, it was already being asked. And once Rome starts asking questions like that, someone usually starts sharpening a knife. By this point, Rome had a problem, and unfortunately, the problem was wearing a crown. Caligula had survived scandals, he had survived rumors, he had even survived the ocean. But surviving embarrassment is not the same as keeping power. Power in Rome depended on fear, respect, money, and men with swords deciding they still liked you. Caligula was losing at least two of those. The Senate hated being humiliated, the nobles hated being threatened, and the guards hated being treated like furniture with knives. So the whispers became meetings, the meetings became plans, and the plans became the kind of plans you do not write down. In the middle of this tension was the Praetorian Guard. They were close enough to protect Caligula, close enough to hear him, close enough to know exactly how bad things were getting. One guard in particular would become very important. His name was Cassius Chaerea. He was a Praetorian officer, a soldier, a man with access, and, according to later stories, a man Caligula enjoyed insulting. This was not wise. If someone guards your life, try not to make him your enemy. But Caligula had never been famous for reading the room. Resentment built quietly, not in speeches, not in public, but in corridors, corners, and locked rooms. The plot was not loud, it did not need to be. Eventually, quiet plots have to become loud events. And in Caligula's case, that event came inside the palace. Not on a battlefield. Not at sea, not even during some glorious rebellion speech. It happened in a corridor, which is very Roman. Because if Rome had a problem, Rome often found a hallway. Caligula was moving through the palace when the conspirators closed in. Cassius Caria was there. Other guards were there too, and suddenly, the man who had ordered armies around was surrounded by men with very sharp opinions. History does not need us to make this part graphic. Let us just say the emperor's luck finally ran out. The palace, which had once protected him, became a trap. The guards, who had once served him, became the danger. And Rome, which had once cheered him, went very quiet. For a moment, nobody knew what would happen next. Killing an emperor was one problem. Replacing him was another. The Senate suddenly remembered that it liked the idea of having power again. Some senators dreamed of restoring the Republic, which was adorable. Because while the Senate was thinking, the soldiers were searching. And in the palace, they found someone hiding. Claudius, Caligula's uncle, a man many people had underestimated, possibly because he spent much of his life being treated like a background character. But background characters have a funny habit. Sometimes the plot suddenly needs them. The Praetorian Guard looked at Claudius. Claudius looked at the Praetorian Guard, and Rome prepared for the strangest job interview in imperial history. Claudius had not exactly planned to become emperor that day. In fact, hiding behind a curtain is usually not step one of a career plan. But Rome had entered one of those moments where logic took a short vacation. The Senate wanted power, the soldiers wanted stability, and Claudius mostly wanted to remain alive. So the Praetorian Guard made a very practical decision. They supported Claudius, which was excellent news for Claudius, and deeply annoying news for the Senate. Because while the senators were debating the future, the army had already found it behind a curtain. Claudius became emperor. Rome moved on, because Rome was very good at moving on from disasters it had personally created. But Caligula's story did not move on quietly. It became a warning, a joke, a political nightmare with a very weird beach episode. And that is why people still remember the emperor who supposedly declared war on the sea. Maybe the details changed over time. Maybe the story became funnier with every retelling. But the point survived. Give one man too much power, and eventually he may try to fight the ocean. The ocean will be fine. The empire may be less so. So the next time someone says history is boring, remind them of Caligula, the emperor who wanted glory, found an ocean, collected some shells, and somehow became immortal. Not as a conqueror of Britain, but as the man who picked a fight with the sea.